The most brutal battle in Hollywood wasn't about dramatic fights or jealous confrontations. It was a chilling legal execution between two women. Mary Castle, a proud 20-year-old actress, mistakenly believed that sleeping with the studio mogul had transformed her into an untouchable queen. She didn't know that her rival, the legitimate wife, Joan Perry, had never shed a tear. Without any jealousy or insults, Joan calmly threw a divorce petition onto the table, threatening to tear apart half of the film empire's assets. This ruthless economic leverage immediately forced the tyrannical husband to his knees. From a man wielding absolute power, he meekly became a blade in his wife's hand, activating the brutal legal machine to crush and permanently erase the existence of his delusional mistress in a mere 24 hours. The foundation for this brutal erasure was laid months earlier, built entirely on a profound illusion of power. Mary Castle was exactly 20 years old. She walked onto the Columbia Pictures studio lot with a specific kind of confidence. It was the confidence of a young woman who believed she had deciphered the secret code of Hollywood. Possessing vibrant red hair, a flawless figure, and a face meticulously designed by the studio to resemble their biggest rebel, Rita Hayworth, Mary saw herself as an invincible weapon. She looked at Harry Cohn, the 60-year-old tyrannical head of the studio, and saw a man she could easily control. She looked at his wife, Joan Perry, and saw an aging 40-year-old woman who was no longer relevant. Mary made a fatal miscalculation. She believed that raw sexual allure was the ultimate currency in Los Angeles. She did not understand that true power is never measured by the firmness of your skin. True power is measured by the signatures on legal documents. Joan Perry was precisely 20 years older than Mary Castle. She lived in a heavily guarded mansion in Beverly Hills. She was a former actress. She had navigated the exact Yi's AIM studio system that Mary was currently entering. Joan knew the game. She knew how the lighting worked. She knew how the casting couch functioned. She knew the exact lifespan of a beautiful young girl in a town built on fresh meat. When the whispers of her husband taking a new 20-year-old mistress reached her, she did not react. She did not throw a glass against the wall. She did not drive down to the studio lot to confront the girl. Joan Perry did not react with tears. She viewed the situation purely through the lens of economics. She looked at the situation with the cold, analytical precision of a majority shareholder. Her husband, Harry Cohn, was a ruthless dictator. He ruled Columbia Pictures through intimidation and fear. He destroyed careers before lunch. He verbally abused directors. He terrified actors. But Joan knew his secret. She knew the foundation of his empire was heavily tethered to their marital assets. California community property laws were ironclad. Joan did not possess the fleeting beauty of a 20-year-old starlet. She possessed a marriage certificate. That single piece of paper gave her the legal authority to freeze bank accounts, to demand corporate audits, and to effectively dismantle Columbia Pictures piece by piece. She watched Mary Castle flaunt her youth from a distance. Joan felt nothing but a clinical, detached pity for a girl who was walking blindly into a slaughterhouse. The environment at Columbia Pictures in the early 1950s was not a nurturing artistic community. It was a factory. It produced moving images for mass consumption. Harry Cohn was the factory boss. He demanded absolute obedience from his employees. When his top-earning asset, Rita Hayworth, began to rebel against his obsessive control, he needed a solution. He could not afford to lose the revenue she generated. He decided to manufacture a clone. The talent scouts brought him Mary Castle. She was young, hungry, and moldable. She had the right bone structure, Cohn did not sign her because he saw a brilliant theatrical mind. He signed her because she was a compliant replica. He initiated the trap immediately. The casting couch was not a myth. It was a standard industrial procedure. It was a transaction. Cohn used his immense structural power to manipulate the young actress. Cohn manipulated her with promises of leading roles, global fame and wealth, requiring only her physical submission in exchange. Mary accepted the terms. She walked into his private office. She traded her body for a studio contract. She believed she was making a savvy business decision. She believed she was seducing a titan. She failed to realize that she was merely a disposable commodity stepping onto an assembly line. Harry Cohn was not a man capable of genuine affection. His psychological profile was built entirely on a foundation of deep-seated insecurity. He was a crude, uneducated man who surrounded himself with beautiful people to mask his own profound inadequacies. He used young women like Mary Castle to validate his masculinity. He paraded her around the studio, bought her expensive gifts, and gave her prominent screen time. He created an illusion of intimacy. He made her feel indispensable. This was a calculated tactic. By making her feel powerful, he ensured her absolute loyalty. He bound her to him not with love, but with the intoxicating drug of proximity to power. Mary absorbed the illusion completely. She began to change. The 20-year-old girl who had arrived at the studio desperate for work vanished. She was replaced by a woman who believed she was the unofficial queen of Columbia Pictures. Believing she was untouchable, Mary began to dictate her lighting, complain about her wardrobe, and treat the crew with the same arrogant disdain as Harry Cohn. She believed she was protected by an invisible shield. She believed that because she slept in the bed of the boss, she was immune to the rules of the factory. She strutted across a studio lot, displaying her youth and her influence. She was loudly and publicly staking her claim on a married man. She was daring the world to challenge her position. She completely misread the hierarchy of the men around her. The directors, the producers, and the executives who smiled at her and accommodated her demands did not respect her. They despised her. They accommodated her purely out of fear of Harry Cohn. They saw her exactly for what she was. She was a temporary distraction. She was a symptom of the boss's midlife crisis. They knew that her power was entirely derivative. It did not belong to her. It was loaned to her by a man who could revoke it at any second. They watched her alienate the crew and build a massive roster of enemies. They waited patiently for the inevitable collapse. Mary's arrogance blinded her to the basic mechanics of Hollywood survival. An actress maintains her position through box office returns or through powerful alliances. Mary had neither. She was entirely dependent on a single volatile source of power. She believed her physical relationship with Cohn superseded his legal relationship with his wife. She assumed Joan Perry was a relic sitting in a quiet house, completely disconnected from the reality of the studio. She assumed that youth always conquers age. It is a common delusion among the young and the beautiful. They believe that history begins the moment they walk into a room. They ignore the deep, entrenched structures of wealth and legal authority that govern the actual world. Joan Perry remained in Beverly Hills. She did not engage in the petty gossip of the studio. She maintained her social schedule. She attended the necessary functions. She projected an image of total, unbothered stability. She collected information. She had informants within the studio infrastructure. She knew exactly what Mary Castle was doing. She knew what Mary was saying. She knew about the expensive gifts Cohn was purchasing. Joan tracked the expenditures. She quietly monitored the shifting power dynamics, observing Mary's erratic behavior from a distance. She understood the psychology of her husband perfectly. Harry Cohn projected an image of a fearless, roaring tyrant. He cultivated a reputation for absolute brutality. But Joan knew the truth. Behind the loud voice and the aggressive posturing, Cohn was a profoundly fearful man. He was terrified of losing his status. He was terrified of poverty. He was terrified of public humiliation. His entire identity was inextricably linked to his position as the head of Columbia Pictures. Without the studio, he was nothing. Joan knew that if she threatened the studio, she threatened his very existence. Mary Castle continued her performance. She was cast in several films. She received favorable press coverage. The studio publicity machine churned out articles comparing her to the great stars of the era. They manufactured a compelling narrative. The poor, beautiful girl who found success in the golden age of cinema. The reality was a grim, mechanical transaction. She was working grueling hours under intense pressure. The studio controlled her diet, her hair color, and her public appearances. She was entirely subjugated by the very system she thought she had conquered. The stress of the dual life began to manifest. She was expected to perform flawlessly on camera while simultaneously managing the volatile moods of an aging dictator off camera. Cohn was jealous, demanding, and unpredictable. He required constant validation. Mary had to navigate his paranoia and his aggressive behavior. The 20-year-old girl was rapidly aging under the crushing weight of the arrangement. She relied on the promises he made. She relied on the illusion of her own security. She refused to see the precarious nature of her position. She refused to acknowledge that she was standing on a trapdoor. She continued to escalate her behavior. She wanted recognition. She wanted the status to be made official. She began to pressure Cohn. She wanted him to leave his wife. She wanted the mansion in Beverly Hills. She wanted the title. She believed she had earned it. She believed her youth was a superior asset to Joan's history. She pushed the tyrant. She tested the boundaries of her influence. She thought she was maneuvering him toward a divorce. She was actually handing Joan Perry the exact ammunition required to execute a flawless corporate assassination. Joan watched the escalation. She saw the subtle shifts in Cohn's behavior. She saw his distraction. She saw the financial leaks. The affair was no longer a quiet, discreet arrangement. It was becoming a loud, messy public liability. It was threatening the reputation of the studio. It was threatening the stability of the boardroom. It was time to intervene. Joan did not pack a bag. She did not threaten to leave. She did not raise her voice. She simply scheduled a meeting with her legal team. She laid out the facts, provided the documentation, and outlined her demands. The strategy was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. She would not fight Mary Castle. She would simply force Harry Cohn to choose between his temporary biological gratification and his permanent financial empire. She knew exactly what choice a coward would make. The legal ultimatum was ready, leaving Cohn with no choice but to sever ties with his young mistress to protect his empire. Harry Cohn commanded Columbia Pictures from an office designed specifically to intimidate. The desk was elevated on a raised platform, forcing directors, actors, and writers to physically look up at him when they spoke. There were no chairs for visitors. If you were summoned to see the head of the studio, you stood. You shifted your weight nervously while he screamed obscenities and threatened to destroy your livelihood. He cultivated a mythology of absolute terror. People called him a monster. People called him a tyrant. He encouraged these titles. He utilized ear as a management tool to extract maximum productivity from his contracted labor force. He wanted the industry to believe he was an immovable force of nature. He was projecting an elaborate, sophisticated lie. Behind the elevated mahogany desk, Harry Cohn was fundamentally a coward. His entire identity was inextricably tied to the corporate structure of the studio. He was not a self-made aristocrat. He was a ruthless street fighter who had clawed his way into executive power and lived in constant, absolute terror of being thrown back out into the street. His tyrannical behavior was not the manifestation of supreme confidence. It was the frantic, aggressive defense mechanism of a man who knew his position was precarious. He required constant external validation to soothe his massive, crippling insecurities. He sought this validation not through artistic achievement, but through the systematic domination of vulnerable people. Mary Castle was the perfect target for his specific brand of psychological exploitation. She was 20 years old, completely inexperienced, and fiercely ambitious. Cohn did not view her as a human being. He viewed her as raw material. The casting couch dynamic in 1950s Hollywood was not a secret hidden in the shadows. It was the foundational economic principle of the studio system. It was a cold, brutal transaction. Cohn utilized the massive resources of Columbia Pictures to construct a glamorous, blinding trap for the young actress. He did not offer her a standard contract. He offered her proximity to the throne. He authorized the wardrobe department to dress her in expensive, custom-tailored gowns. He instructed the makeup department to meticulously craft her image. He assigned studio publicists to manufacture a compelling narrative about her rise to stardom. He was investing capital in his new asset. Mary mistook this corporate investment for personal devotion. She walked onto the sound stages wearing thousands of dollars worth of silk and diamonds, completely unaware that she did not own a single thread of it. The studio owned the clothes. The studio owned the image. The studio owned her. Cohn utilized a specific tactic to isolate and control her. He made her feel as though she was his exclusive confidant. He complained to her about the incompetence of his directors. He complained about the greed of his male stars. He created a false intimacy, a shared secret world where it was just the two of them against the brutal machinery of Hollywood. He told her she was different. He told her she was special. It was a calculated script he had used a dozen times before on a dozen different girls. Mary swallowed the script whole. She believed her youth and her beauty had somehow bypassed his notorious cruelty. She believed she had unlocked a hidden, softer version of the tyrant. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was merely participating in a highly predictable psychological routine. She operated purely on surface-level dynamics. She equated sexual leverage with institutional power. She began to test the boundaries of her perceived influence. She arrived late to the set. She demanded script changes. She spoke disrespectfully to veteran crew members. She strutted across the Columbia lot with the arrogance of a conquering general. She believed the terrified compliance of the crew was a testament to her own importance. She did not realize they were not bowing to her. They were bowing to the invisible shadow of Harry Cohn that followed her everywhere. The physical manifestation of her delusion was striking. She moved differently. The hesitant, desperate posture of a struggling actress was replaced by the rigid, entitled stance of a studio queen. She demanded the best dressing rooms. She demanded exclusive access to the top makeup artists. She treated the studio lot as her personal playground. She was completely blind to the silent, intense hatred brewing among the people she alienated. The lighting technicians, the script supervisors, and the camera operators all watched her arrogant displays with cold, calculating eyes. They knew the history of the studio. They knew that girls who behaved like Mary Castle always ended up discarded and destroyed. They simply waited for the inevitable execution. Harry Cohn fueled her delusion because it served his immediate needs. Having a beautiful, arrogant 20-year-old mistress parading around his territory validated his masculinity. It proved to his rivals that he was still virile, still powerful, and still capable of claiming the most desirable women in the city. He used her youth to mask his own rapid aging. He paraded her at exclusive restaurants and private parties. He bought her expensive gifts using studio funds. He enjoyed the scandal. He enjoyed the whispers. He believed he was completely insulated from any real consequences because he was the boss. He was entirely delusional about his own security. He believed his title protected him from the basic laws of economics. He ignored the fundamental reality of his own marriage. He treated his wife, Joan Perry, as a silent, distant figurehead. He assumed she would tolerate his highly public infidelity because she enjoyed the wealth and status of being his wife. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. He mistook her silence for submission. He mistook her lack of public outrage for acceptance. He did not understand that Joan was not a desperate starlet clinging to his coattails. She was a seasoned veteran of the Hollywood machine, and she held a massive stake in his empire. Cohn lived a parasitic existence. He derived his power from the corporate entity of Columbia Pictures, and that corporate entity was heavily entangled with his marital assets. California community property laws did not care about box office receipts or casting couch arrangements. The law dictated an equal division of assets in the event of a divorce. Cohn's entire fortune, his stock options, his real estate, and his executive power were all on the table. He was a tyrant who ruled an empire, but he did not hold the exclusive deed to the land. Joan Perry held the deed. While Mary Castle was busy alienating the crew and demanding larger trailers, the true power dynamic of the situation was quietly shifting miles away. Harry Cohn sat in his elevated office screaming at producers, believing he was the master of his universe. He was completely unaware that he was standing on a highly volatile fault line. He continued to indulge his 20-year-old mistress, ignoring the mounting tension. He believed he could compartmentalize his life. He believed he could keep the loud, messy affair separate from the cold, hard business of the studio. This compartmentalization was impossible. The affair was becoming a massive distraction. The financial resources diverted to indulge Mary's demands were drawing attention from the studio accountants. The disruption on the set was causing production delays. Mary's arrogant behavior was becoming a public relations liability. Cohn's judgment was clouded by his own massive ego and his desperate need for physical validation. He failed to see the danger closing in around him. He failed to realize that his young mistress was not a trophy. She was a ticking time bomb directly attached to his bank accounts. Mary's behavior escalated. She began to demand official recognition. She wanted more than just gifts and leading roles. She wanted the status of a legitimate partner. She started pressuring Cohn to leave his wife. She used her youth as a weapon. She pointed out the age difference between herself and Joan. She believed her physical superiority was an undeniable argument for her elevation. She nagged him. She threatened to withhold her affection. She attempted to play the game of power using the only currency she understood. Cohn reacted with typical aggression. He hated being pressured. He hated being told what to do. The illusion of the compliant, moldable replica began to shatter. Mary was becoming difficult. She was becoming expensive. She was demanding a level of commitment he had absolutely no intention of providing. The dynamic shifted from a mutually beneficial transaction to a tense, volatile standoff. Cohn began to withdraw his favor. He became cold. He became dismissive. The gifts stopped arriving. The leading roles were suddenly given to other actresses. Mary panicked. Her entire identity was tied to his approval. She did not have a backup plan. She had burned her bridges with the crew and the other executives. She had no allies within the studio infrastructure. She intensified her demands. She became desperate. The physical manifestation of her panic was visible on set. Her flawless makeup could not hide the dark circles under her eyes. Her arrogant strut was replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. She began to realize the precarious nature of her position. She realized she had built a house on sand, and the tide was coming in. She attempted to force Cohn's hand. She confronted him in his office. She bypassed his secretaries and marched directly up to the elevated desk. She demanded an explanation. She demanded security. She demanded he fulfill the promises he had made in the dark. It was a fatal error. You do not issue demands to a tyrant in his own throne room. Cohn looked down at the 20-year-old girl standing before him. He did not see a beloved partner. He saw a nuisance. He saw a liability. He saw a rapidly depreciating asset. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. He told her to get back to work. He reminded her in brutal, explicit terms exactly who owned her contract and who controlled her future. The confrontation completely shattered Mary's delusion. The mask of the benevolent protector slipped, revealing the cold, calculating face of the industrial boss. She realized she was completely powerless. She realized her youth and her beauty were utterly useless. SS against a man who viewed human beings as disposable inventory. She retreated from the office, humiliated and terrified. The reality of the casting couch transaction was finally exposed in all its grotesque detail. She had sold herself to a machine, and the machine was preparing to spit her out. She walked across the studio lot a ghost, haunting the very place she thought she ruled. The crew members watched her pass. They did not offer sympathy. They offered cold, indifferent stares. They knew the execution was imminent. Harry Cohn sat behind his desk, his heart pounding with aggressive adrenaline. He believed he had successfully managed the situation. He believed he had put the arrogant starlet back in her place. He believed he had reasserted his absolute dominance over his territory. He was completely wrong. He had merely swatted a fly while a heavily armored tank was rolling up to his front door. The threat to his empire was not coming from the 20-year-old girl demanding a bigger dressing room. The threat was coming from the 40-year-old woman sitting in the Beverly Hills mansion, reviewing legal documents with a team of ruthless attorneys. Joan Perry had finished collecting her data. She had finalized her strategy. She had prepared the ultimatum. Cohn's fatal weakness was his absolute terror of losing his wealth and his status. Joan knew exactly how to exploit this weakness. She did not need to scream, cry, or throw a drink. She simply needed to present him with a mathematical equation. He could keep the 20-year-old girl and lose half of Columbia Pictures, or he could execute the girl and retain his empire. It was not a difficult choice for a coward. Harry Cohn was about to prove exactly how fast a tyrant will drop to his knees when his bank accounts are threatened. The glamorous trap he had built for Mary Castle was about to be repurposed as a lethal execution chamber. The man who projected absolute power was about to become the terrified instrument of his wife's cold, calculating revenge. The industrial machinery of Hollywood was preparing to completely annihilate a 20-year-old girl, and the order was going to be signed by the very man who had lured her into the gears. The confrontation did not occur in a crowded restaurant or a dramatic public setting. It occurred in the immaculate, suffocating silence of a formal dining room in Beverly Hills. Joan Perry did not raise her voice. She did not shed a tear. She sat perfectly straight at the head of a long mahogany table. She wore a tailored suit. She did not look like a grieving wife. She looked like a corporate executioner. Harry Cohn arrived home expecting the usual quiet submission. He walked into the dining room and found his wife flanked by two senior partners from the most ruthless family law firm in Los Angeles. The trap was sprung before he even took a seat. Joan pushed a single manila folder across the polished wood. She did not demand an explanation for his highly publicized affair. She did not ask for an apology. She simply instructed him to open the folder. Cohn looked at the documents. It was a draft of a divorce petition. It was accompanied by a meticulously detailed financial audit of his entire net worth. The audit included his real estate holdings, his liquid cash, and his controlling shares in Columbia Pictures. California was a community property state. The law was absolute. In the event of a divorce, the wife was entitled to exactly 50% of everything acquired during the marriage. Joan Perry owned half of the studio. She delivered the ultimatum with the cold, clinical detachment of an accountant finalizing a ledger. She gave him exactly two options. He could continue his affair with a 20-year-old actress. If he chose this option, Joan would file the petition the following morning. She would force the liquidation of his assets. She would drag the studio through a highly public, destructive financial battle that would alert the shareholders to his reckless mismanagement. She would strip him of his executive power and reduce him to a minority stakeholder in the empire he had built. The second option was equally brutal, but financially secure. He could terminate the affair immediately. He could completely, permanently sever all ties with Mary Castle. He would ensure the girl was removed from the studio lot and blacklisted from the industry to prevent any future retaliation. If he executed the mistress, Joan would bury the divorce petition. The marriage would continue strictly as a corporate partnership. His wealth would remain intact. His throne would be secure. Harry Cohn built his entire reputation on being an immovable, terrifying force. He screamed at directors. He threatened male stars with physical violence. He crushed unions. But sitting across from his wife, he instantly collapsed. The facade of the omnipotent studio boss vanished. He was exposed as a deeply insecure man who derived his entire sense of self-worth from his bank balances. Faced with the immediate, credible threat of losing half his fortune and his grip on Columbia Pictures, he did not hesitate. He did not attempt to negotiate. He did not defend the young woman he had spent months manipulating. He threw Mary Castle under the tracks of the corporate machine to save his own skin. He agreed to his wife's terms without a second thought. The tyrant proved himself to be a spectacular coward. Joan Perry did not smile. She did not experience a rush of emotional vindication. She simply nodded. The business transaction was complete. She had successfully protected her assets. She dismissed her lawyers and left the room. She did not care how Cohn disposed of the girl. That was an administrative problem. She only cared that the threat to her portfolio was neutralized. Cohn returned to the studio the next morning a deeply agitated man. He needed to execute Mary Castle swiftly, but there was a significant legal complication. Mary was not a day player. She was a contracted actress. Cohn had signed her to a long-term deal to ensure his absolute access to her. If he simply fired her without cause, the studio would be legally obligated to pay out the remainder of her contract. It would be a substantial financial settlement. Cohn was an incredibly cheap man. He refused to pay a single dollar to a woman he was discarding. He summoned the head of his legal department. He demanded a solution. He needed to terminate the contract without financial penalty. The studio lawyers provided the perfect weapon. They advised him to activate the morals clause. The morals clause was a draconian legal provision embedded in every single studio contract since the 1920s. It was originally implemented to protect the financial investments of the studios following a series of massive public scandals. The clause stated that the studio possessed the unilateral right to terminate an employee without compensation if the employee engaged in any conduct that shocked public decency, brought the studio into disrepute, or demonstrated moral turpitude. It was an incredibly broad, entirely subjective piece of legal machinery. It allowed the studio executives to act as judge, jury, and executioner over the private lives of their workforce. The hypocrisy of using the morals clause in this specific situation was staggering. Harry Cohn was a married man in his 60s who had used his immense corporate power to coerce a 20-year-old girl into a sexual relationship. He was the architect of the immoral conduct. Yet he was now preparing to use a legal mechanism designed to protect public morality to destroy the very woman he had exploited. He was weaponizing his own adultery to execute his victim. The law did not exist to punish the guilty. It existed solely to protect the elite. Cohn authorized the strike. Before the legal department could serve the termination papers, they needed to construct a narrative. They needed to manufacture public justification for the firing to ensure Mary could not fight back in court. The studio possessed an extensive network of fixers, publicists, and gossip columnists on their payroll. Cohn unleashed them. The whisper campaign began immediately. Blind items started appearing in the Los Angeles tabloids. They did not mention Cohn. They focused entirely on Mary Castle. They described an unnamed young actress at a major studio who was displaying erratic behavior. They hinted at severe alcohol abuse. They suggested she was engaging in highly promiscuous activities with various unnamed men. The studio publicists systematically planted stories detailing her arrogance on set. They portrayed her as difficult, demanding, and entirely unprofessional. They were actively dismantling her reputation in real time. Mary arrived at the studio completely unaware of the massive execution order moving through the corporate pipelines. She felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. The crew members who normally offered terrified compliance now actively ignored her. The makeup artist refused to make eye contact. The directors spoke to her in short, clipped sentences. She was treated like a ghost. The invisible shield of Harry Cohn's protection had evaporated. She was suddenly highly vulnerable. She attempted to contact Cohn. She called his private office line. The secretary informed her that Mr. Cohn was unavailable. She walked to his executive suite. The security guards physically blocked her path. They told her she did not have an appointment. The panic set in. The reality of her situation began to crash down upon her. She realized she had completely lost access to the only source of power she possessed. She was a 20-year-old girl standing alone in the middle of an industrial complex that was actively preparing to grind her into dust. She was summoned later that afternoon. The summons did not direct her to the elevated mahogany desk of the studio boss. It directed her to a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room in the legal department. She walked into the room. Harry Cohn was not there. Instead, she faced a panel of cold, unsmiling corporate attorneys. They did not offer her a chair. They did not offer her a glass of water. They treated her like a hostile liability. The lead attorney pushed a single piece of paper across the table. It was a formal notice of termination. Mary stared at the document. The legal language was dense and unforgiving. It stated that her contract with Columbia Pictures was immediately voided. It cited a direct violation of the morals clause. It accused her of engaging in conduct unbecoming of a studio representative. It explicitly stated that due to the nature of the violation, she was not entitled to any severance pay, any residual income, or any further compensation of any kind. She was stunned. She tried to speak. She tried to explain her relationship with Cohn. She thought the lawyers did not understand the dynamic. She thought there was a massive misunderstanding. The attorneys cut her off. They informed her that Mr. Cohn had personally authorized the termination. They informed her that they possessed extensive documentation regarding her erratic and immoral behavior. They told her that if she attempted to challenge the termination in court, they would release the documentation to the press and completely destroy whatever remained of her life. They were blackmailing her with a fabricated narrative designed by the very man who had ruined her. She was given exactly 15 minutes to clear her personal belongings from her dressing room. She was escorted by 2 armed studio security guards. They walked closely behind her, ensuring she did not speak to anyone on the lot. The walk from the legal department to the dressing room was a public parade of total humiliation. The crew members watched her pass. They saw the security guards. They knew exactly what was happening. It was a studio execution. The AR, arrogant starlet, was being thrown out with the trash. No one offered sympathy. No one offered help. They simply watched the machine function. She gathered her few personal items into a cardboard box. She left behind the expensive silk gowns and the diamond jewelry. She did not own them. The studio owned them. She was stripped of the glamorous illusion she had inhabited. She walked back out into the harsh California sun. The security guards escorted her directly to the main gate on Gower Street. They stood behind her as she walked through the heavy iron turnstiles. The gate clicked shut behind her. The sound was loud and final. It was the sound of a career ending. It was the sound of a life being severed. Mary Castle stood on the public sidewalk holding a cardboard box. She was 20 years old. She had no money. She had no representation. She had a toxic reputation manufactured by the most powerful men in the city. The studio fixers had already made the phone calls. The Blacklist was active. Every major casting director, every producer, and every executive in Hollywood already knew the directive. Do not hire Mary Castle. She is a liability. She is a target of Harry Cohn. She looked back at the studio lot. The massive sound stages loomed over the brick walls. Inside those walls, Harry Cohn sat at his elevated desk, his bank account secure, his marriage intact. Joan Perry sat in her Beverly Hills mansion, her financial empire protected from the threat of a youthful intruder. They had successfully utilized the legal system and the corporate machinery to completely annihilate a human being without ever getting their hands dirty. Mary Castle stood on the concrete. The intoxicating delusion of her own power was completely shattered. She realized she had never been a queen. She had never been a partner. She had been a temporary, disposable product, and the factory had just discontinued her line. She had nothing left but the crushing weight of her own profound stupidity and the the terrifying vast emptiness of a city that had just erased her name from the map. The crisis in Beverly Hills was officially averted. Joan Perry remained in her immaculate, heavily guarded mansion. She did not organize a celebration. She did not seek out friends to boast about her victory. She simply resumed her meticulously scheduled life. The corporate structure of her marriage held firm. She had successfully utilized a single legal document to neutralize a biological threat to her financial empire. She proved that emotional detachment is the ultimate armor of the elite. She viewed the entire sordid affair not as a personal betrayal, but as a minor breach of contract that required immediate aggressive correction. The ledger was balanced. Her wealth was secure. Her hands were completely free of blood. She had orchestrated the absolute destruction of a rival without ever raising her voice. Harry Cohn returned to his elevated mahogany desk at Columbia Pictures. The brief, humiliating moment of terrified submission in his dining room was instantly compartmentalized and buried deep within his psyche. To mask the lingering shame of his cowardice, he aggressively overcompensated. He screamed louder at his directors. He bullied his writers with renewed ferocity. He fired minor employees for trivial infractions. He desperately needed to reestablish the mythology of his absolute terrifying power to hide the reality that his wife had just effortlessly forced him to his knees. He settled back into his executive chair, the undisputed boss of the factory once again. He completely erased Mary Castle from his mind. She was no longer a person. She was a canceled project. The system had functioned perfectly, insulating the tyrant from the consequences of his own predatory behavior. Mary Castle stood on the outside of the heavy iron gates on Gower Street. She initially believed she could simply walk to another studio. She assumed she could take her manufactured red hair and her flawless figure to Warner Brothers or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. She possessed the naive belief that her physical product was still highly viable on the open market. She completely failed to grasp the mechanics of an industry cartel. Hollywood was a fiercely competitive landscape for box office revenue, but the studio bosses colluded absolutely on matters of labor control. Harry Cohn did not need to send formal letters or issue public decrees to ruin her. A few quiet phone calls were made from his elevated desk. A few brief, coded conversations occurred at exclusive executive lunches. The directive was established and universally accepted. Mary Castle was radioactive material. The phone in her small Los Angeles apartment stopped ringing. Her talent agent stopped returning her calls. The industry did not formally reject her. It simply stopped acknowledging her existence. This sudden, absolute silence was far more devastating than the loudest, screaming match. It was the silence of structural erasure. She was a 20-year-old girl whose entire identity, wardrobe, and public persona had been constructed by a corporation. Now the corporation had issued a total recall on the product. She lost her income immediately. Her savings, meager compared to the extravagant lifestyle she had been briefly allowed to sample, vanished rapidly. The social execution followed the financial ruin. The glamorous restaurants and exclusive nightclubs that had welcomed her just weeks prior now turned her away at the door. The maitre d's, keenly aware of the shifting power dynamics of the city, looked right through her. She was no longer the untouchable girl on the arm of the studio boss. She was a massive liability. Associates she believed were her friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. The invisible shield of Harry Cohn's protection had evaporated, leaving her exposed to the brutal, unforgiving elements of a city that fundamentally despised weakness. Stripped of her status, her finance, Seal's security and her manufactured identity, the profound humiliation began to fester. The intoxicating delusion of power she had harbored was violently replaced by the terrifying reality of utter powerlessness. She had no legal recourse. She had no severance pay. She had no union protection to fight the fabricated morals clause violation. She was entirely alone. She sought an escape from the crushing, suffocating weight of her sudden invisibility. She did not seek therapy or a new career path. She sought the immediate blinding numbness provided by cheap alcohol and heavy sedatives. She drank to forget the elevated desk and the false promises whispered in the dark. She swallowed pills to blur the memories of the cold, unsmiling corporate lawyers who had handed her the termination papers. She spiraled rapidly into the dark, isolated fringes of Los Angeles. The vibrant, arrogant starlet who genuinely believed she could manipulate a corporate empire with her youth, and her body was reduced to a discarded, heavily medicated ghost. She haunted the shadows of a city that had already forgotten her name, trapped in a cycle of addiction and police arrests. The execution was total. The machinery of the studio had crushed her into dust, leaving her with absolutely nothing, abandoned in the dark, while the executives continued to count their money in the light. The destruction of Mary Castle was not an anomaly. It was the standard operating procedure of the golden age of Hollywood. The morals clause was never designed to uphold public decency or protect the integrity of the art. It was a highly effective, hypocritical legal weapon designed to protect the capital of the elite and dispose of vulnerable labor without financial penalty. Joan Perry proved that true power does not reside in the firmness of youth or the allure of beauty. True power resides in leverage, legal authority, and the cold, unflinching willingness to enforce it. Harry Cohn proved that tyrants are fundamental cowards when their bank accounts are directly threatened. And Mary Castle learned the most brutal, unforgiving lesson of all. In a city built and governed by ruthless capitalists, proximity to power is a dangerous illusion. You either own the machinery or you are eventually crushed by the gears.